transforming the world at the beginning of the 20th century. For decades, America's oil fields had supplied most of the world market. But now America had a powerful competitor, Russia. In Baku, in the Caucasus, is to be found the long-deserted office of Ludwig Nobel, who did more than anyone else to create the Russian oil industry. The Nobel brothers were Swedish armaments manufacturers who had come to Baku years earlier and bought an oil refinery. From this office, preserved exactly as he left it, Ludwig directed his far-flung enterprise. He would walk up these stairs and from the tower, survey his growing empire. He was known as the Russian Rockefeller. The rapid expansion of Russian oil would challenge the global supremacy of the real John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil Company.
To take on Standard Oil was to take on really what was probably the most powerful company in the world. It was an aggressive competitor. It would seek to squash, to diminish those who were trying to sell oil in opposition to it.
Rockefeller's company, with its headquarters at 26 Broadway in New York City, spanned the entire world. This huge American corporation shipped its oil products to every corner of every continent. It had few true competitors.
If a new competitor entered a market, Standard Oil would come in and cut prices in that market and raise them elsewhere. It had global reach, which nobody else did. It also had a global intelligence network, which enabled it to be very well informed about what its rivals and competitors were doing.
Far away, on the other side of the world, lies the tropical island of Sumatra. In 1880, it was part of the Dutch East Indies. Oil found here, together with that from Russia, was to change the whole balance of power in world oil. Jan Zilker was a Dutch settler.
He came from a northern Dutch farmer's family. Stubborn, hardworking, no nonsense. And he seems to have had an unhappy love affair and decided to go to the east and make his fortune there. One night, while he was with his mandur, his supervisor, going through the fields, when there was a terrible thunderstorm. And they took shelter in an old tobacco shed, and the mandur lighted a torch. And he was surprised because it was so bright. And he said, "What do you put on it?" And the man said, "We find in water wells tar." So Zerker took some samples, and when he got the report, it said it was a very good quality crude oil.
Zilker's discovery fueled what would become a new oil empire. At this time, oil was mostly used to make kerosene, which provided lighting in people's homes all over the world. The market for kerosene was enormous, and Standard Oil had almost 80% of it. But Standard's dominance was soon to be challenged by Royal Dutch Shell. Today, the largest international oil company, it emerged from a struggle between two companies, Royal Dutch and Shell, and between two men. Henry Detterding, son of an Amsterdam sea captain, was a banker by training. Marcus Samuel was the son of a Jewish trader. He rose from the poverty-stricken streets of London's East End to become the city's Lord Mayor. Detterding became the greatest oil man in the world after Rockefeller. He had great vitality and charm. He was also tough, ruthless, and domineering. Bursting with manic energy, he had a dark side to his character.
To me, he was an enormous man and used to chase me and my brother around the house. He was always known as Godja Godja, Grandpa, because he used to come roaring after us, saying, Godja, Godja, Godja. In other words, probably his way of saying, I'm going to get you. And of course, we as small kids were terrified of him.
Detterding, the dashing Dutchman, married 3 times, pursued many love affairs, and lived a cosmopolitan lifestyle. His rival, Marcus Samuel, was very much a Londoner and a family man, devoted to his wife Fanny and his 4 children.
They were very different sort of people. They were both in their ways, of course, very big sort of personalities, but in fact quite different personalities.
Detterding was interested in business, wanted to make money, wanted to succeed in it. In a way, for Samuel, making money, succeeding in business was an avenue, a tool to social acceptance.
Marcus Samuel was not only Jewish, of course, but an East End Jew, not one of the Jewish establishment. He wasn't one of those at all. He was really the equivalent, the modern-day equivalent, if you like, of Barrow Boy would be. And so he came from nowhere. So he was very impressed by, if you like, the trappings of office. And to be Lord Mayor was indeed the dream of, if you like, a Jewish Dick Whittington.
It was a gamble on Russian oil that would make Samuel's great fortune. When Samuel first visited Baku in 1890, the Russian oil industry was already well established, and it was dominated by the nobles. The nobles had supplied weapons to the armies of the Tsar. Ludwig's brother Alfred invented dynamite. Later, he set up the Nobel Prize. The infant oil industry that the nobles had first encountered in Baku in the 1870s was backward, hazardous, and notoriously inefficient. The nobles were scientists and engineers, and they transformed the industry with modern methods and new technologies.
It only took a few years for the Nobel family to establish themselves as the premier group in the Russian oil industry. They were very scientific, they applied chemistry, they organized a great enterprise. The people who worked for them called themselves Nobelites and had a special sense of comradeship, and they were at the very top of the oil industry. And indeed, the Nobels became the #1 oil group in the Russian Empire and a force in the world oil market.
By 1890, Baku had become a great oil center with 200 refineries. The leading company was Nobel, whose workforce alone supplied half of Russia's domestic market. Baku's new wealth was reflected in its elegant streets, and its leading citizens had even built a grand opera house. The second largest oil group in Baku belonged to the French branch of the famous banking family, the Rothschilds. At its head was Baron Alphonse, who was said to have the most famous mustache in Europe.
The Rothschilds were active in the business. They built up a considerable position. They had a problem, though. They couldn't sufficiently market their oil. They needed markets, and they were interested in markets, in particular in the Far East, where their potential was very great. They knew a person who traded in the Far East, who he thought had the vision and the guts and the drive to work something out, and that was Marcus Samuel.
Marcus Samuel was born into the close-knit Jewish community in the East End of London. He never forgot his roots in this poor district, and his religion was to have a powerful influence on him all his life. Marcus was named after his father, who had built up a sizable business trading with the Far East.
They were certainly bringing back Japanese produce like porcelain and earthenware, and as personal possessions they also acquired quite a number of Japanese art treasures. The firm were dealing in a large way in produce generally. Barley from Chile was one product, dates from the Persian Gulf, and even opium for the pharmaceutical industry from a firm named Kazaruni. They were great shippers of opium in those days.
Marcus and his brother Sam, his lifelong ally, went to work for the family firm. When their father died, his will instructed the executor,
if he finds them, as I have every reason to hope, worthy and honourable men, he will, on their attaining 25 years, give them shares in the business. And on his doing so, all my sons will be united, loving and considerate, and keep the good name of Marcus Samuel from reproach.
One of the main imports of the family firm had been seashells used to make shell boxes for Victorian ladies. Years later, Samuel named his company Shell to honor the memory of his father.
Marcus Samuel was an ingenious, adventurous, somewhat impulsive person and a man of vision. He spoke in a quiet voice. People would lean forward to hear what he had to say, but he had the ability to get people to do what he wanted to do and to take enormous risks.
They used to have most tremendous arguments. Marcus was the man with imagination and adventurous, and Sam was the conservative one who was always trying to tone him down.
They would whisper back and forth, and then they would start shouting at each other, and one would denounce one as an idiot, and the other would be equally angry, talking back and forth. And finally, they would say, we understand what we're going to do, and Marcus would say to Samuel, go to the telephone, make the deal.
Marcus and his brother had played an important role in the early industrialization of Japan and built up a fine collection of Japanese art. Their Far Eastern contacts seemed to offer the Rothschilds what they needed, access to the markets of Asia. As Marcus said,
markets have to be found, and in this case, almost have to be created, because it's a well-known axiom in business that nothing sells itself.
Having met the Rothschilds, Marcus Samuel recognized that he had a fantastic opportunity to create a new global oil trading company. He also knew that it was going to be very risky and dangerous because he was going against the most powerful international company, John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil. And he knew that Standard Oil would do everything it could to frustrate and prevent this new venture from getting off the ground.
Well, Rockefeller was pretty well everywhere. In fact, I suppose the nearest comparison I can think of would perhaps be IBM in the 1960s or 50s, a huge share of the world market. And therefore, if a newcomer was about to start in one particular market, he was able to squeeze them out by just slashing the prices in that one market.
the Rothschilds knew all too well that they would have to find a way of foiling Rockefeller if they were to sell their oil in the Far East. So they invited Marcus Samuel, with his Far Eastern connections, to solve the problem. Marcus Samuel visited Baku and conceived a bold plan. He would, in effect, beat Rockefeller at his own game.
So Samuels and his colleagues recognized that what they needed to do was to do everything simultaneously, to get all the elements together in order, in effect, to stage a coup in the world oil market and get their oil from Baku all the way around the world to the Far East.
But that, in turn, would require a new kind of ship.
On a reconnaissance trip to the Russian oil area, he'd seen these primitive but new type of boats called tankers. Instead of transporting oil in tins, as it normally was done, it could be more economically transported in these floating bottles. And when he came back to England, he commissioned a major new engineering advance, which was large seagoing tankers.
The first tanker in the Samuel fleet was launched at West Hartlepool in July 1892. Tankers would be essential to the plan. To be competitive, Samuel would need to get permission to ship his oil through the Suez Canal and thus slice thousands of miles off the journey.
But in those days, it was all shipped in cans, but the Suez Canal would not accept bulk oil because it was considered too risky.
Samuel's plans to ship his oil could not escape Standard Oil's worldwide intelligence network.
They, working through a London law firm, fought very hard on all sorts of grounds, citing safety and everything else, to try and prevent the Suez Canal Authority from granting permission. But they failed, and Samuel was able to send his tanker through the Suez Canal as a critical element in his coup against Standard Oil.
And meanwhile, Marcus had sent two nephews of the Abraham brothers out to set up staging points between the Black Sea and the Far East, so that when the tankers got through the canal, they had places to stop and load up and unload.
Mark and Joe Abrams had only one clear qualification for the job. They were family. Mark's letters to his uncles were full of woe.
You have no idea of the amount of opposition we have to put up with from the merchants here. Let me know the arrangements as soon as you can, so that we can go to work, or we shall be all behindhand, and the boats will be upon us before we're ready for them.
They had lots of arguments with head office, like anybody out in the country does. The Abrams wanted to do this, and the brothers said, no, you must do that, and so on. But they set it up, and because they had great problems. And when they got to, I think it was Singapore, they had difficulty in buying land for a tank installation because the people didn't want to live anywhere near it. They were frightened of these things.
In August 1892, the Murex, Samuel's first tanker, passed through the Suez Canal. But then in the ports of the Far East, he hit an unexpected snag.
He had assumed that once they got the oil to the distribution points in the Far East, the local people would show up with their receptacles, which they had formerly purchased with Standard Oil kerosene in it, and they would come and get it filled up with Marcus Samuel's oil. However, what he didn't recognize is that the people of the Far East loved the blue cans of Standard Oil and used them for making cooking places and bird cages and all sorts of different things. And so suddenly Samuel found that he had his oil in the Far East, but he didn't have the mechanism for people to actually come and buy it. And so very hurriedly, with the quick responsiveness that's required of a successful entrepreneur, he succeeded in getting plants built in the Far East that would make the tin receptacles for people to put the kerosene in. And where Standard Oil's kerosene cans were blue, his became red, and they became quickly as well known in the Far East and is put to many uses as the blue kerosene cans of Standard Oil.
Samuel's Far Eastern coup was complete. His first tanker was quickly followed by many more, and soon he had an entire fleet.
There were 10 or 14 tankers altogether. Tiny ones, as we would think today. They were less than 5,000 tons gross, most of them. And they were all named after the shells which they used to trade in, the Murex and the Cowrie and so on.
Marcus Samuel really was a classic entrepreneur. He had a distaste for system, for organization, for bureaucracy, for committees. His idea of running his business was really to run it out of the hat, which meant making decisions as they occurred to him, not necessarily well-connected decisions, sometimes acting quite impulsively, and resisting that systemization that comes with the growth of a larger enterprise. So his whole fleet of ships, which started to become quite a large fleet of tankers, was run out of a small room in his office that had nothing in it except 2 chairs, a table, a small map of the world, and 2 clerks.
Marcus Samuel's future rival and partner, Henry Detterding, 13 years his junior, was born into the Amsterdam middle class and grew up on this quiet street. As a young man, he left home and went to seek his fortune in the Dutch East Indies. It was out there that he joined Royal Dutch. The story of Royal Dutch is told in the stained glass windows at the company headquarters in The Hague. Royal Dutch started as a small company with a grand name. It was formed to exploit oil found in the Dutch colonies. Those early years were hard on the pioneers who toiled in the jungles of Sumatra. Jean-Baptiste Auguste Kessler was Detterding's future boss. His letters home tell of the difficulty and the strain.
The company's position is really critical. The smallest hitch and everything will collapse. If things go wrong, my job and my name are gone, and my extraordinary exertions will be repaid with censure into the bargain.
On top of his other difficulties, Kessler had to cope with the effects of a long, simmering colonial war. For years, the Aceh tribe had been fighting against the Dutch colonists. In 1882, hundreds of well-armed Aceh attacked Royal Dutch's installations, killed some of its workers, and torched the compound. Kessler feared that next time the Aceh would set fire to the oil fields. Unless the war was stopped, Royal Dutch's enterprise was doomed. The colonial government moved swiftly and ruthlessly to suppress the Aceh rebellion, perhaps the earliest example of a war fought and won for the sake of oil. The Dutch could now work the oil fields unhindered. The labor was hard and the technology rudimentary. Kessler's frustration boiled over in his reports.
Half-heartedness, ignorance, indifference, dilapidation, disorder, and vexation are everywhere apparent. And it is in these circumstances that we have to expand the enterprise if we wish to make ends meet.
Despite everything, the oil flowed, and the enterprise was on its way. Operations were expanding, and Kessler needed a deputy. In Henry Detterding, Kessler found the man for the job.
A first-rate businessman. A pushing fellow with seasoned experience and a good eye for business.
This was Detterding's chance, and he took it. He set about learning every part of the oil business, but it was a hard and often lonely life.
The production sites in the oil industry were self-contained miniature societies, enclaves on very remote locations. They were self-contained in the sense that they had very little to do with the surrounding environment.
Life was extremely lonesome, and the great isolation in which people lived, it made people visit each other during the one free day there was every 2 weeks. And then they would do an enormous amount of drinking and merrymaking.
But Detterding did not succumb to drink and dissipation. His hobby was reading company balance sheets. Having joined Royal Dutch, he quickly won the respect of its board of directors. In 1900, on his way home to Holland, Kessler died, worn out by hard work and tropical disease. Detterding was asked to take over as managing director. He was only 34 years old. Almost immediately, he had to fight off a formidable challenge. The threat came from Standard Oil, which was trying to break into oil production in the East Indies. If Standard succeeded, it would endanger Royal Dutch's operations there and the very future of the company. Local sultans were getting rich selling the rights to drill on their lands. Under an agreement with the colonial government, they were only supposed to sell to Dutch companies. But Standard Oil, using a favorite ruse, was setting up front companies with Dutch names to trick the sultans into selling their concessions in Sumatra.
Standard Oil desperately wanted to get into Jambi in the south of Sumatra because this was the newest region where oil had been found in Indonesia. There was, however, one way in which the Dutch government could prevent foreign companies to move in, and that was by not approving of the concessions which had been granted by local sultans. In Jambi, there were scores of applicants to get concessions, but none of them were granted because the government knew that these were all straw men of Standard Oil.
But Shell was not seen as a threat and was drilling side by side with Royal Dutch on the island of Borneo.
They had concessions next to one another, but only the Shell had a refinery on the spot. And it was a source of great annoyance with the Royal Dutch to have to ship its crude to the north of Sumatra. So there were very tangible benefits to be had from cooperation on the local level.
To fight off Standard's onslaught on his Far Eastern operations, Detterding knew that he had to strengthen his company. He decided to build on the connection he already had established with Marcus Samuel's company, Shell. So together with Samuel, he set up an international marketing operation based in England. By this time, Samuel was a man of some standing. He had become an alderman of the City of London and had bought himself a stately home in Kent, where he played cricket and lived the life of an English country gentleman. Detterding, still very much the junior partner, visited and was impressed. He decided he wanted a country estate of his own, so he imported bricks from Holland and built a mansion. Detterding himself designed the house and landscaped the grounds at Kelling Hall in Norfolk.
Samuel was quite impressed by that young man, Detterding. They got along quite well. Detterding was introduced in British circles, and in fact he played quite well the role of an English gentleman. He liked the English country life, and the personal contacts between Samuel and Detterding were usually very good. Also, the financial results were quite good, and that helped, of course.
He was now spending most of his time in England. Associates would come for the weekend and enjoy his hospitality. He too now enjoyed the life of an English country squire. But one colleague observed,
His purpose was that of any merchant, great or small, something extremely matter of fact, to make money.
But money was not everything to Marcus Samuel. In 1902, he achieved a lifetime ambition. He became Lord Mayor of London. When he became Lord Mayor, he broke with tradition by diverting his inaugural parade so that it would take him through the poor streets of the East End, where he had grown up. His wife, Fanny, instead of watching the parade from the mansion house as was expected, joined the crowds in the Jewish ghetto. The new Lord Mayor was a hero to the children of the quarter who got together to buy him a diary. That night, he made his first diary entry.
From the very first, I had a splendid reception from the populace, culminating in a great ovation through my own ward. We're deeply grateful that everything has been so wonderfully successful.
Detterding, Samuel's guest at the Lord Mayor's show, was not so impressed.
The Lord Mayor's show was very fine, according to the view here. But in Dutch eyes, it was like the ceremonial parade of Oscar Carey's circus. The banquet was a very brilliant affair. It has satiated me for the rest of my life. I certainly would not think it worth a white tie to attend a second time.
Marcus Samuel worked hard for charities. His many ceremonial duties as Lord Mayor took up even more of his time. And so he rarely had time to visit his office, and business began to suffer.
Probably one of the critical bad decisions was his involvement with Texan oil. Oil had been found, it was gushing out. Samuel fixes up a supply contract with a key Texan producer, but there was a problem. The production was unstable. Soon, oil has temporarily stopped flowing. Samuel is forced to convert his oil tankers into ships to carry Texas cattle.
The Texas fiasco incensed an old colleague who launched a blistering attack on the Samuel brothers before resigning from the board.
You are, and always have been, too much occupied to be at the head of such a business. Mr. Sam is incompetent, and there is no one else. It is a business, I clearly see, that has no head or tail to its management. There seems only one idea: sink capital, create a great bluster, and trust to Providence. Such a happy-go-lucky frame of mind in business I have never seen before.
Events about to erupt in Baku posed an even greater threat to Marcus Samuel. Oil from Imperial Russia had been the basis of his company and his fortune. Now, communist revolutionaries, including the young Joseph Stalin, were agitating among the workers in the oil fields. When revolution shook the Russian Empire in 1905, Baku became a center of insurrection and ethnic conflict. In September, workers set fire to the oil fields. A survivor said,
The flames from the burning derricks and oil wells leapt up into the awful pall of smoke which hung over the inferno. I realized, for the first time in my life, what could be meant by the words, all hell let loose.
This was the first time a major oil field had been deliberately put to the torch. It was also the first time that major oil supplies were interrupted by political conflict. And Marcus Samuel's company, Shell, was disastrously undermined.
Really, the finances of the company had become quite dilapidated, and finally one of Samuel's key employees told him that the only hope for survival of this company he'd created and that he really loved was to merge it with Detterding's Royal Dutch. But then he had a new shock, because when he went to see Detterding to talk to him about it, he discovered that Detterding, while very interested in a merger, was also absolutely intent on doing the merger on his terms. Because while the finances of Shell Transport and Trading had gotten worse, Royal Dutch had become extremely profitable and a much stronger company.
Marcus Samuel was running out of time. Negotiations went on for months as Shell's position weakened and Detterding held firm. Finally, the moment came for a showdown between the two men.
Detterding, who had a great charm, but also had a very strong personality, made him an offer for which Samuel first thought, that's ridiculous.
It's going to be 60% Royal Dutch in this new group and 40% Shell. Samuel was outraged, 50-50, or he wouldn't go forward. And Detterding said, sorry, we do it on my terms or we don't do it at all.
Samuel wanted to leave the room to consult his partners in his business, but Detterding said, I'm in a very good mood now, you can either take it or leave it. And Samuel took it.
I think Royal Dutch saw several advantages in acquiring Shell. It had oil fields, it had oil tankers and distribution facilities, and of course it had the British flag. Detterding, whose vision is to create a global oil company, I think quickly perceived the advantages of having that global oil company wrapped in the flag of Britain, rather than a small power like the Netherlands.
The merged group would be known as Royal Dutch Shell. So far, kerosene had been the main oil product. Now motor cars were creating a vast new market. In America, Standard Oil quickly established a commanding lead in the market for gasoline. For Detterding, Shell's best form of defense was always attack. To strengthen the new combination for its struggle with Standard, Detterding took Shell into America, and he succeeded where Marcus Samuel had failed.
He saw quite clearly the only way to take on Rockefeller was on his own home ground. Yes, he didn't lack nerve.
But Standard Oil had problems of its own, problems which helped Detterding's bold challenge to succeed. For years, Rockefeller's near monopoly over the American oil industry had been under attack from the press and from politicians. After a long legal battle, the Supreme Court ruled that it was an illegal monopoly and ordered Standard Oil to be broken up. This was good news for the new Royal Dutch Shell Group and Detterding.
Here were two struggling, fairly minor companies that came together for survival. And at the same time, you had the breakup of the Standard Trust, which led, of course, to the formation of a great number of companies, which we know very well today. Mobil used to be Standard Oil of New York. SO is Standard Oil, Chevron, Amoco. All these companies came out of this one trust. Had that not been happening at that time, I think even the amalgamated company of Royal Dutch Shell would have had a pretty tough time.
Far away in the harsh, unforgiving land of Persia, now Iran, a fresh challenge was emerging for Shell. For 5 tough years, a determined English geologist named George Reynolds had been exploring the desert for oil. Resourceful and stubborn, Reynolds alone kept the project going. When Anglo-Persian, which later became BP, British Petroleum, began to lose its nerve, Reynolds ignored instructions and carried on as he saw fit. In 1908, Anglo-Persian wrote to Reynolds telling him to wind up his operation. Before the letter could arrive, on May 26th at around 4 o'clock in the morning, Reynolds struck oil. The first oil to be found in the Middle East. managing director of Anglo-Persian was the formidable Charles Greenway. Greenway knew all too well that the company was in desperate need of capital to pay for plant and equipment to expand and develop its Persian oil. Greenway would do almost anything to ensure the independence of his company.
Anglo-Persian was slipping in, not so much slipping, diving really into a financial crisis of quite serious proportions. And Greenway was certainly faced with the prospect of having to raise some money to keep the business going. He had also been faced with something which he probably did really without any relish at all, and that was to enter into an agreement with Royal Dutch Shell, whereby Shell took much of the crude oil, kerosene and benzene that was produced by Anglo-Persian. So there was two things. A, he very badly needed money, and B, it looked almost as if the growth of Anglo-Persian could be sort of stymied from the outset, you know, really by being put in a very junior position to Shell.
The Royal Navy was to be the salvation of Greenway and Anglo-Persian. In 1911, the Navy began converting from coal to oil. The young First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, had decided that oil would give British battleships extra speed and a crucial advantage in the arms race with Germany. Churchill said, "Mastery itself is the prize." Greenway saw his chance and convinced Churchill that the Navy must be supplied by at least one all-British company and not rely entirely on Shell, which he said was run by foreigners.
And the Shell menace was, as he put it out, Shell was a company in which there was Jewish influence, the Samuel family, there was Dutch influence, Detterding, Royal Dutch, and the suggestion or the implication was that somehow the Shell, as he put it, would fall under the influence of the German government, which it was clear had become, in those years, the main rival to Britain on the world stage.
Greenway's arguments started to appear in government correspondence. One infamous letter from the Admiralty was circulated in its original draft form among civil servants and caused particular offense.
Mr. Detterding, this man, wrote, "The real manager of all this concern is an extremely clever, brackets unscrupulous, crossed out, businessman who is ably seconded by the Jewish, crossed out, other interest in the Shell Company."
But Churchill was running a big risk. The blunt fact was that the company in which the Navy was basing an important part of its future was in financial peril and did not have the money to develop its Persian oil. Churchill took another momentous decision. On behalf of His Majesty's government, he bought a 51% share in Anglo-Persian. It would operate as a private company, but 2 government directors would sit on its board to ensure that it always took British strategic interests into account. Marcus Samuel was furious. Not only was his patriotism being challenged, but the British government was becoming the majority stockholder in his competitor. In a fiery parliamentary debate, Samuel's allies demanded that Churchill explain himself. Churchill would not budge.
We have no quarrel with Shell. We have always found them courteous, considerate, ready to oblige, anxious to serve the Admiralty and to promote the interests of the British Navy and the British Empire, at a price. The only difficulty has been the price. But it seems to me that our relations might become even more pleasant if, instead of being compelled, as we might easily be, to accept whatever price they might think it right to charge, we had an independent position.
Many of the phrases Greenway had used in his letters to the government are to be found in Churchill's speech. But I don't think Churchill believed it, and the fact that he sent a private letter to Detterding saying, well, basically this is politics, I think is pretty conclusive proof.
In August 1914, the First World War broke out. 7 weeks after Parliament had approved Churchill's plan. At the very beginning of the war, a huge German offensive closed in on Paris. It appeared that the City of Lights would fall, but the internal combustion engine and oil came to the rescue. The Paris taxi fleet was commandeered to rush French troops to the front. Paris was saved.
It had been generally assumed that the First World War would be a short war, a war in which the railway powered by coal would be critical. It turned out to be a long war, and the internal combustion engine turned out to have a much larger and more immense effect than anybody thought in terms of the truck, the lorry, the motorcycle, the car, of course, aviation, which went through a tremendous innovation in response to the war, and what perhaps was the critical element in breaking the stalemate on the ground in the trenches was the development of the tank.
The Allies' oil supremacy gave them an edge over the Germans, who made a last desperate attempt to grab the oil resources of Baku to fuel their war machine. They failed, a crushing blow that helped lead to the Allied victory.
What the First World War established was the strategic significance of oil, that oil, access to oil, possession of oil, the ability to use oil would be a critical element in national power, and that was one of the lasting lessons of the First World War.
By the end of the war, Anglo-Persian, later to become BP, was firmly established as a major company. But it was Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil of New Jersey that had supplied the bulk of the oil used by the Allies. Marcus Samuel's patriotism was no longer in question. He had lost his son and both his sons-in-law to the war. The question of Shell's loyalty had also been laid to rest.
I have a book here, The Shell That Hit Germany Hardest, and there's a rather nice little quotation in the front of it, saying, without toluol, without petrol and oil fuel supplied by the Shell organization, the Allies could not have beaten the Germans. So, obviously, he did play quite an important part in the war, and for that, he was awarded the Légion d'honneur by the French and got knighted by the British.
For his contribution to the war effort, Marcus Samuel was given a peerage. He was made Lord Bearsted. He now held the purely honorary position of chairman of Shell. Detterding was firmly in charge, taking on Rockefeller's successors in every corner of the world. His annual report threw down the gauntlet.
We must not be outstripped in this struggle to obtain new territory. Our geologists are everywhere where any chance of success exists.
Under Detterding's leadership, Royal Dutch Shell expanded enormously. He had shaped a great global organization. He had been the greatest oil man since Rockefeller. But Henry Detterding, Marcus Samuel's old partner, had, in his old age, become a Nazi sympathizer.
I think he was a supporter of Hitler when he saw how well Hitler was doing, getting Germany out of a really thorough mess, which it was in the early 30s. And then there is some family talk about it, the fact that when he realized that he'd backed the wrong horse when Hitler started really rampaging around Europe, this is possibly what killed him.
Henry Wilhelm August Detterding died in 1939, before the outbreak of the Second World War. A quarter of a century earlier, at the start of the First World War, he had written,
"This is a century of travel, and the restlessness that has been created by the war will make the desire for travel still greater."
What Detterding and Samuel had shared, perhaps more than anything else, was a vision of oil that would shape the 20th century, as well as the energy, drive, and skill to make it happen. Marcus Samuel died in 1927, too early to know of Deterding's support for the Nazis. On a foggy January morning, thousands of people from the East End of London joined the funeral procession. Fanny, his wife of 45 years, died the same day, and they were buried together. The chief rabbi delivered the eulogy.
We have lost a great Jew and a great Englishman. We have lost a true woman of worth. They were lovely and pleasing in their lives, and in their deaths they were not divided.
Next, on the prize, the Black Giant. World War I brought victory to the Allies and a thirst for oil to an America on wheels. Desperate for a steady supply, an American businessman sought out the kingpin of the Middle East oil fields. He never thought to look in his own backyard, where a Texas wildcatter was spinning the industry out of control. Based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Daniel Yergin, The Prize.